The trick to making an invisible seam like this one is in a bit of planning. We have to stop knitting one of the pieces right after the wrong side row, the row that forms a garter ridge right underneath the needle on the right side of the work. Because garter stitch looks the same on both sides, I mark the right side of the work with a marker. And we have to stop knitting the other piece after the right side row, the row that creates a set of stitches between the garter ridge and the needle. Arrange the pieces so that the piece with the garter stitch right underneath the needle is at the bottom and the other piece is at the top. Then move the stitches closer to the tips of the needles. The tips of the needles should be at the right side of the work and the yarn tail should be at the right side of the work. The length of the yarn tail of the piece at the top is not relevant, so cut it just long enough to weave it in later on. We'll use the tail that is attached to the piece at the bottom and cut the tail that is at least 3 times as long as the width of the piece as the length of the future seam. I usually cut it 4 times as long just to be sure that I don't run out of yarn before the seam is finished. So thread this tail, the long tail, into a wool needle, and for this tutorial I'm going to use yarn in a contrasting color, but normally of course we would use yarn in the same color as the project. To join the pieces, insert the wool needle from right to left into the first stitch of the piece at the bottom and the first stitch of the piece at the top. Then slip both stitches off the knitting needles and pull the yarn through. Don't pull the yarn too tight. The strand between the stitches, this part of the strand, should be about as long as one leg of an average stitch in the fabric. Now insert the wool needle from front to back into the first stitch of the piece at the bottom, and from back to front, that would be right to left, into the next stitch of the same piece. Slip the stitch off the knitting needle and pull the yarn through. Again, leave the strand that is about as long as the average stitch in the fabric. So as you see, when we work stitches of the piece at the bottom, we go in one stitch and out of the next stitch. Now we're going to work stitches of the other piece, and this time we're going to do the opposite. We'll go out, that means back to front, into the first stitch, and we'll go in, that is front to back, into the next stitch. Slip the stitch off the knitting needle and pull the yarn through. Adjust the length of the strand, and let's move to the piece at the bottom. We go in and out of the next stitch. Slip it off the needle and pull the yarn through. Piece at the top, out, that is back to front, and in to the next stitch. Slip it off the needle and pull the yarn through. And that's how simple it is. So we just repeat these 2 steps. In, out, slip, pull the yarn through. Adjust the length of the strand. Out, in, slip, pull the yarn through, adjust the length of the strand, and keep going until you join all stitches and there are no stitches left on the knitting needles. I take the last stitch off the knitting needle and the piece at the bottom, and the last stitch of the other piece. That's it. Here's the seam. Now the last thing we need to do is to join these last stitches with one stitch like this, and then weave in the secure the yarn and weave in the tails. And that's how the seam looks. Of course you can see where it is because we worked with the yarn in a contrasting color, but when we make this seam in the yarn with the yarn in the same color as the project, then the seam is completely invisible. See, if not for the tail that I left on purpose, it would be hard to tell where the two pieces of fabric are seamed. The full tutorial about this technique is at 10rowsaday.com/graft garter stitch. Have a wonderful week, my friend. I'll talk to you next week in a new tutorial.